The autumn wind of 1975 did not just blow through the hills of western Massachusetts. It seemed to bite right through the bone. It carried the scent of damp earth, rotting oak leaves, and the unmistakable, bitter tang of an ending. For 74 years, the Miller homestead had stood as a monument to quiet, unbroken labor. Its timber had weathered the Great Depression, the fierce New England blizzards, and the passing of 3 generations who poured their sweat into the rocky soil. But on this particular Tuesday, the gravel driveway was choked not with tractors or hay wagons, but with the cold, gleaming steel of sedans from the city. Men in sharp, charcoal-gray suits stepped out, their polished leather shoes sinking into the mud that old Arthur Miller had tilled with his bare hands. They carried clipboards, not shovels. They wore calculated, detached expressions, completely immune to the sacred history of the land they were about to tear apart. Behind the faded lace curtains of the farmhouse kitchen, Martha Miller sat entirely alone. Her hands, knotted with arthritis and stained by decades of berry picking and vegetable canning, trembled slightly as they wrapped around a cold porcelain mug of black coffee. She didn't drink it. She just needed something to hold on to. Outside, the booming, rhythmic auctioneer's chant had already begun, slicing through the crisp morning air like an executioner's blade. "Do I hear 5? Do I hear 5? Now 5,000. Who will give me 6? To the men with the clipboards, it was a routine liquidation, a simple foreclosure on a delinquent mortgage that the widow could no longer afford after Arthur's heart finally gave out in the spring. But to Martha, every strike of the auctioneer's gavel was a physical blow, a violent tearing away of her life's tapestry. Her husband's old John Deere tractor, the hand-carved oak dining table where they had celebrated 50 anniversaries, the very quilt her mother had stitched for her wedding night. All of it was being laid out on the dead grass, categorized by lot numbers, and sold to the highest bidder. Tears did not fall from her eyes. They had dried up weeks ago, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing numbness. She was being erased from her own life, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The crowd gathered in the yard was a painful mix of curious neighbors who couldn't bear to look Martha in the eye, and wealthy land speculators from Boston who smelled blood in the water. The local farmers stood near the back, their hands shoved deep into the pockets of their worn canvas jackets, their faces grim. They knew that if the bank could do this to the Millers, the oldest family in the valley, none of them were safe. The atmosphere was heavy with a collective, suffocating helplessness. The local Savings and Loan Association had sent their chief vice president, corporate coldness personified, to ensure the bank reclaimed the property for a pittance, intending to flip the pristine acreage to a suburban housing developer. The bidding for the land itself was about to begin, and everyone knew the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The bank would bid the exact amount of the outstanding debt. No local farmer could afford to match it, and Martha would be given 30 days to pack what little she had left into a cardboard box and vanish into the welfare system. The auctioneer cleared his throat, raised his microphone, and the crowd fell into a deathly, expectant silence. Then the rusted iron gate at the edge of the property creaked open. It was a slow, agonizing sound that drew every eye away from the auctioneer's podium. Walking down the gravel path, completely unbothered by the hostile stares of the bank executives, was an old man. He didn't belong to the valley, nor did he look like a wealthy investor from the city. He wore a faded, grease-stained oilskin duster that looked as old as the farmhouse itself, and a battered Stetson hat pulled low over eyes that seemed to possess the depth of an ancient ocean. His boots were covered in dust from a long journey, stepping with a slow, deliberate cadence that commanded respect without demanding it. He didn't carry a clipboard, and he didn't join the crowd of onlookers. Instead, he walked straight to the edge of the porch, stood beneath the shadow of the old elm tree, and rested his weathered hands on a heavy wooden cane. He didn't say a word, but his sudden, mysterious presence shifted the entire energy of the yard. The air grew perceptibly colder, and a collective whisper rippled through the local farmers. Who was he? Why was he here? And more importantly, what was he looking at with such intense, quiet ferocity? The auctioneer's voice boomed over the loudspeaker once more, desperate to regain the crowd's fractured attention. All right, folks, we are moving to the main event. Lot number 42, the Miller farmhouse, the barns, and the surrounding 160 acres of prime agricultural land. We will start the bidding at the balance of the outstanding lien, $45,000. Do I hear $45,000? The bank vice president stepped forward with a smug, practiced smile, raising his sleek gold pen to signal his opening bid. The auctioneer nodded instantly. $45,000 to the gentleman from Valley National Bank. Do I hear 46? $46,000 for this beautiful piece of New England history. He looked around the crowd, but the local farmers looked down at their boots. $45,000 in 1975 was a fortune, an impossible sum for men who lived season to season, relying on the mercy of the weather and the fluctuating price of milk. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the dry rustle of the oak leaves overhead. The vice president checked his gold watch, thoroughly satisfied. The game was won before it had even truly begun. Inside the house, Martha closed her eyes, preparing herself for the final strike of the gavel that would legally sever her from the only home she had ever known. She thought of Arthur, of the way he used to come in from the fields smelling of hay and honest sweat, and how he had promised her on his deathbed that the land would always protect her. It felt like a broken promise now, crushed under the weight of corporate interest and unyielding ledgers. The auctioneer raised his gavel high into the air, going once at $45,000, going twice. The crowd held its breath, the collective tragedy of the moment weighing heavily on every chest. The vice president turned slightly, already preparing to walk back to his sedan, eager to escape the depressing rural scenery and return to his comfortable office in the city. 46. The voice was not loud, but it possessed a gravelly, resonant depth that cut through the open air like a foghorn in the night. It came from beneath the shadow of the old elm tree. The mysterious stranger in the oilskin duster hadn't moved an inch, but his arm was raised slightly, holding an old leather-bound ledger against his chest. The auctioneer froze, his gavel hovering precariously in mid-air. The bank vice president spun around, his face instantly contorting from smug satisfaction to utter disbelief. He looked at the stranger, scanning the faded clothes and the battered hat, trying to comprehend who this intruder was. The crowd erupted into a flurry of frantic whispers. 46,000? The auctioneer stammered, coughing slightly into his microphone to regain his composure. The gentleman under the tree bids $46,000. Bank, what say you? The vice president sneered, stepping aggressively toward the auctioneer's platform. He raised his gold pen again, his voice dripping with condescension. 47,000, he barked, glaring directly at the stranger, attempting to intimidate him with the bottomless pockets of a financial institution. He expected the old man to back down, to realize he was playing a game he couldn't possibly win. But the stranger didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the vice president. His gaze remained fixed entirely on the front door of the farmhouse, as if he could see right through the wood to the grieving widow hiding inside. He waited precisely 3 seconds, letting the tension build until the silence became unbearable, before opening his mouth again. $50,000. The stranger's voice remained perfectly level, completely devoid of anger or excitement. It was the tone of a man stating an absolute, unalterable fact. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of local farmers. $50,000 was unprecedented for an estate sale in this part of the county. The bank vice president's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. His pristine leather shoes stepped deeper into the mud as he confronted the auctioneer directly. "This is absurd," he hissed, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I demand to see proof of funds from this individual. This is a legally binding foreclosure auction, not a theatrical performance. Does he even have the means to back up such a ridiculous claim, or is he simply wasting our time?" The auctioneer looked uncomfortably at the stranger, clearing his throat. "The bank raises a valid point, sir. This auction requires a 10% cash deposit immediately upon the fall of the gavel, with the remainder due within 24 hours. Can you verify your ability to comply with these strict terms?" The stranger didn't say a word. Instead, he slowly reached inside the deep, cavernous pocket of his oilskin duster. The entire yard watched in absolute, breathless silence as his weathered hand emerged, holding a thick, heavy canvas bank bag, bound tightly with a frayed piece of hemp rope. He walked forward, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel, and dropped the bag directly onto the auctioneer's wooden table. The sound it made was heavy, solid, and undeniable. With slow, deliberate movements, the stranger untied the rope and tipped the bag forward. Neatly stacked blocks of United States currency slid onto the table. Old, crisp $100 bound in official Federal Reserve bands. There wasn't just $5,000 in that bag. There was a small fortune. The auctioneer's eyes widened in sheer astonishment as he ran a trembling finger over the clean edges of the cash. The bank vice president stepped back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, completely stripped of his corporate arrogance. This wasn't a drifter. This was a man who had come prepared for a war, carrying the specific weaponry needed to win it. "The funds are verified," the auctioneer whispered into the microphone, his voice trembling slightly with newfound awe. "The bid stands at $50,000 to the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 51 from the bank?" The vice president looked at the cash on the table, then at his clipboard, his mind racing through the strict budgetary limits imposed upon him by the board of directors. They wanted the land, but they wanted it cheap. They hadn't budgeted for a bidding war against a phantom with a bag full of cash. He gritted his teeth, his eyes narrowing to slits as he raised his pen one last time, desperate to save face in front of the locals. $55,000, he announced, his voice cracking slightly under the immense weight of the pressure. He thought the massive $5,000 jump would finally break the stranger's resolve. He thought wrong. The stranger didn't hesitate for a single second. $60,000. The announcement fell upon the yard like a thunderclap. The bank vice president slowly lowered his gold pen, his hand shaking with a mixture of rage and complete defeat. He knew he was done. The board would never authorize $60,000 for a rural farmstead in 1975, no matter how much potential the land held for future development. He looked at the stranger one last time, searching for some clue, some hint of identity beneath the shadow of the Stetson hat, but found only an unyielding, stony resolve. Without saying another word, the vice president turned on his heel, signaling his associates to follow him. They retreated to their luxury sedans, their tires spinning furiously in the mud as they fled the property, leaving behind a trail of exhaust and ruined pride. The auctioneer let out a long, slow breath, looking around the stunned crowd. Going once at $60,000. Going twice. He paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the hills, before bringing the heavy wooden gavel down onto the table with a sharp, definitive crack. Sold to the gentleman under the elm tree for $60,000. A hesitant, emotional cheer broke out among the local farmers. Hats being tossed into the air, hands clapping against shoulders in a sudden, overwhelming release of tension. The corporate wolves had been driven away from the door. But as the initial excitement began to wane, a deep, profound curiosity returned to dominate the yard. Who was this man, and what did he intend to do with the Miller farm? The stranger ignored the congratulations of the locals, walking calmly to the table to sign the official deed transfer papers, handing over the canvas bag of cash without a single trace of regret. Once the paperwork was finalized, the auctioneer handed him the heavy brass key to the front door of the farmhouse. The crowd watched as the old man walked up the wooden porch steps, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floorboards. He stopped in front of the door, adjusted his hat, and knocked softly. Inside, Martha Miller had heard everything through the open window. Her heart was pounding violently against her ribs as she slowly opened the door, her eyes looking up into the lined, weathered face of the stranger who had just sacrificed a fortune to save her home. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the final leaves of autumn across the porch. Then the stranger slowly reached out and placed the brass key gently into Martha's trembling palm. He looked deep into her eyes, a soft, incredibly warm smile finally breaking through his stern demeanor. Arthur saved my life in the fields of France in 1944. Martha, the old man said, his voice thick with an emotion he had carried for over 30 years. He told me then that if he ever made it back to New England, he'd build a sanctuary for you. I promised him I'd make sure no one ever took it away from you. You're home, Martha. You're staying right here. He tipped his hat, turned around, and walked back down the steps into the quiet New England afternoon, leaving behind a legacy of honor that the banks could never buy. The dust from the stranger's departure had long settled on the gravel road, but the air in the valley remained permanently altered. For weeks, the town spoke of little else. In the local diner, over plates of eggs and steaming mugs of bitter coffee, the old farmers shook their heads in disbelief. To them, the event was a modern miracle, a brief tear in the fabric of an increasingly cold world, where an honest man's word and a soldier's ancient vow had actually triumphed over corporate ledgers. But for Martha, the reality of what had happened didn't truly sink in until the first heavy snow of December blanketed the New England hills. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes drift lazily past the glass. For the first time in years, the sight didn't bring a knot of anxiety to her chest. She wasn't wondering how she would pay the heating bill, or if she would be forced out into the freezing cold before the spring thaw. The heavy brass key sat in a small crystal dish on the mantelpiece, a solid, unyielding proof that her home was still hers. The land, quiet and sleeping beneath the winter frost, still belonged to the name Miller. As the months turned into years, the stranger never returned to the valley. He had vanished back into the vast American landscape as quickly as he had arrived, leaving behind no address, no phone number, and no way for Martha to properly thank him. He didn't want gratitude. He had simply been delivering a piece of mail that was 30 years overdue. But his absence didn't mean he was forgotten. Every time Martha baked a loaf of bread, she thought of the young man her husband had pulled from the muddy trenches of France, a man who had carried the memory of Arthur's kindness like a burning ember, until the moment it was needed to save his widow. The story of the 1975 auction became a legend passed down to the grandchildren of the valley. A reminder that sometimes the good guys win. And on quiet autumn afternoons, when the wind howled through the old elm tree exactly the way it did on that fateful Tuesday, Martha would sit on the porch, look down the empty driveway, and smile. She knew that Arthur was still watching over the property, not through a ghost or a memory, but through the enduring power of a promise kept by a brother in arms.